The report says it was a black bear. I signed that report. I'm the one who wrote it. But bears don't leave 5-fingered handprints in the sap of a cedar tree 30 feet off the ground. I checked the height, the reach, the depth of the marks. It wasn't a bear, so why was I told to bury the photos? Story 1. The Missing Frequency. I spent 6 years at the North Station. You get used to the sounds, the elk, the wind in the gorge, the low hum of the power lines near Sector 7. But you also get used to the radio. It's your lifeline. In the backcountry, silence isn't peaceful. It's a technical failure. You learn to interpret every click, every burst of atmospheric static. You know when a repeater is struggling and when a battery is dying. On a Tuesday in October, I was doing a routine perimeter check on the western ridge. It was one of those days where the air felt heavy, like a storm was coming, but the sky was perfectly clear. There was no wind, no birds, just the sound of my own boots on the shale. That's when the radio chirped. It wasn't a call from dispatch. It was a burst of static that sounded rhythmic. Not random noise, but a pulse. I checked my dial. I was on the primary park band. I switched to the emergency channel thinking maybe someone was keyed up, but there was nothing but clear air. When I moved back to the primary, the pulse was there again. It sounded like a metronome. Click, click, click. Exactly 60 beats per minute. I'm a veteran. I know every repeater in this park. None of them put out a heartbeat. I started walking toward the signal strength, tracking it with my handheld. It led me down into a valley we call the Basin. It's a natural dead zone, high shale walls, dense old-growth pine, and zero cell service. Radios usually die the second you cross the ridgeline because the topography just eats the signal. But as I descended, the signal didn't fade. It got louder. The clicks started to change. They got heavier, more metallic. It wasn't a metronome anymore. It was the sound of a heavy iron door slamming shut over and over every 10 seconds. Clang. I could feel the vibration in my teeth. It was a sound that didn't belong in a forest. There are no iron doors in the basin. There's nothing but trees that haven't seen a chainsaw in 100 years. I stopped at a small clearing. I pulled my handheld and checked the frequency readout. The screen was flickering a deep, bruised violet, a color the LED shouldn't even be able to produce. The frequency readout didn't show the park band. It said 0.00. That's a physical impossibility. You can't broadcast on 0. The slamming stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. Then my own voice came over the radio speaker. It wasn't a recording. It was live. Perfectly clear, without a hint of static. It stated my badge number. Then it said, "I'm right behind you." I didn't turn around. Every survival instinct I have told me that if I looked, I'd be acknowledging whatever was standing there. And in the basin, you don't acknowledge the anomalies. If you don't see it, it isn't real. That's the lie you tell yourself to stay sane. I keyed my mic, reported a radio malfunction to a tower I knew couldn't hear me, and I started hiking back up that shale slope. I didn't run. Running triggers a predatory response in almost everything that lives in these woods. I just walked, eyes fixed on the ridgeline, but every 10 seconds, behind me, I heard it. The heavy iron door slamming against the forest floor. Clang. I requested a transfer the next morning. I told them the isolation was getting to me. The chief didn't ask questions. He just looked at my radio. The plastic casing had melted in the shape of 5 long, thin fingers. Story 2. The Echo in the Culvert. In search and rescue, you learn to fear the drainage systems. Most people think of the woods as wide-open spaces, but the infrastructure beneath them, the culverts, the overflow pipes, the old mining vents, is where the real nightmares happen. These are places designed to move water, not people. We were 3 days into a search for an experienced hiker who had gone missing near the old logging road. This road hadn't been serviced since the 70s. It was overgrown, crumbling, and most importantly, it was built over a series of high-pressure concrete culverts designed to handle the spring runoff from the peaks. I was part of the ground team checking the low zone. The assumption was that the hiker might have slipped and ended up in the creek bed. About 4 miles in, we found one of the main drainage pipes. It was a 24-inch concrete culvert, half buried in a recent rock slide. It was choked with mud, rusted rebar, and stagnant water. One of the rookies pointed his light into the pipe and stopped. He didn't call it out. He just stood there, frozen. I walked over and looked. About 15 feet into that dark, wet pipe, sitting perfectly level on a patch of dry rust, was a single white sneaker. Now, finding a shoe isn't rare in SAR. People lose gear when they panic. But this culvert was 24 inches wide. An adult man in hiking gear couldn't have crawled in there without getting stuck immediately, and the pipe was nearly filled with freezing, muddy water. But the shoe, a clean white sneaker, was bone dry. There wasn't a speck of mud on it. The laces were tied in a perfect tight double knot. I decided we had to retrieve it. It was evidence. Because the rookie was the smallest, we put a harness on his ankles and prepared to slide him in just far enough to grab it. He was hesitant, but we told him we had him on a short leash. He clicked on his headlamp and started to shimmy in. The second his shoulders entered the pipe, the air changed. We could hear it from the outside, a low rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat, vibrating through the concrete. The rookie stopped. He whispered that it was getting hot. He said the temperature inside the pipe was rising, despite the mountain runoff flowing around his legs. He reached for the shoe. Right as his fingers brushed the canvas, the thumping stopped. He let out a scream that I can still hear when I close my eyes. It wasn't a scream of pain. It was pure, unadulterated terror. He started kicking frantically, signaling for us to pull him out. We hauled him back so fast he bruised his ribs on the concrete lip. When he came out, he was hyperventilating, his face as white as the shoe. He didn't have the sneaker. He said that when he touched it, the shoe felt soft, like it was made of skin, and he said he saw something further back in the pipe. He claimed that past the shoe, the pipe didn't continue into the earth. He said it opened up into a room that looked exactly like his childhood bedroom, illuminated by a light source he couldn't identify. He saw his own bed, his own desk, and his own mother sitting there, staring into the darkness of the pipe, waiting for him. We marked the location and called for a camera crawl team. When they arrived 6 hours later with the robotic pipe camera, the sneaker was gone. The culvert was empty, filled with 3 feet of freezing mud. There was no dry patch of rust. There was no bedroom. But when we checked the rookie's hand, the one he'd used to touch the shoe, his fingertips were covered in a fine white powder. We sent it to the lab. It wasn't dust. It was pulverized human bone. Story 3. The Amber Grasp. I was working a timber survey in the northern boundary, a place we call the Old Growth Stand. It's an area of the park that's officially unmapped because the terrain is so vertical and the canopy is so thick that satellite imaging can't get a clear read on the floor. My job was to mark the sentinel trees, the ones over 200 years old that were showing signs of root rot. It was a standard day. Clear sky, thin mountain air, and the smell of dry pine. I was about 6 miles from the nearest fire road when I found the first one. It was a massive ponderosa pine, easily 400 years old. I pulled my marking axe to blaze the bark, but I stopped. About 5 feet up the trunk, there was a handprint. It wasn't painted on, and it wasn't carved. It looked like the tree had grown around a human hand that was pressed against the bark. The wood had rippled and flowed into the shape of a palm and 5 long, slender fingers, but the detail was what stayed with me. You could see the lines of the knuckles, the shape of the fingernails, even the texture of the skin, all perfectly rendered in solid, living bark. I touched it. It didn't feel like wood. It felt warm, not the warmth of a tree sitting in the sun, but the internal heat of a living body. And then the sap started to move. A thick amber liquid began to ooze from the center of the palm. It didn't drip down the trunk like normal resin, it pulsed, it bubbled out in rhythmic bursts, filling the palm of the handprint until the liquid overflowed. It was bioluminescent, a deep honey gold glow that was bright enough to cast shadows on the forest floor in broad daylight. I stepped back, and that's when I noticed the other trees. Every single sentinel tree in that clearing had a handprint. Some were small, like a child. Others were massive, with fingers that wrapped almost halfway around the trunks, and they were all bleeding. The entire clearing was suddenly bathed in this rhythmic, golden light. Then the sound started. It wasn't a voice, but a vibration coming from the ground, a deep, subsonic thrumming that matched the pulse of the amber sap. It felt like the trees were communicating. I looked back at the first tree, the one I'd touched, and my heart nearly stopped. The handprint was gone. The bark had flattened out, the amber sap was being sucked back into the trunk, and a new handprint was forming 6 inches higher. Then another, and another. The prints were climbing the tree, moving upward toward the canopy with a wet, tearing sound. I didn't wait to see what happened when they reached the top. I flagged the area as a biological hazard zone and hiked out. I told my supervisor the soil was unstable. When the survey team went back 2 days later with the official equipment, they couldn't find the clearing. Not because it was hidden, but because the trees were gone. There were just massive hand-shaped holes in the earth where the roots should have been. Story 4. The Mimic in the Mist. The mist in the basin doesn't just block your vision, it eats sound. It's a heavy, wet blanket that turns a shout into a whisper. We were 4 hours into a search for a missing hiker, a 19-year-old kid who'd wandered off during a bachelor's party. We were running a standard line search, spaced 20 feet apart. My radio chirped. It was my partner Miller, Unit 2, about 50 yards to my left. Unit 2 to lead, I've got a visual on a blue windbreaker, northeast quadrant, proceeding to investigate. I acknowledged. Copy that, Miller. Stay on comms. I'm moving to intercept. I started cutting through the brush. 10 minutes passed. No update. I keyed my mic. Unit 2, status report. Did you reach the hiker? Silence. Just the low hum of the mist. I tried again. Miller, do you copy? What's your location? Then the radio crackled, but it wasn't Miller's voice. It was my voice. Copy that, Miller, my own voice said, perfectly clear, coming back at me from my own headset. Stay on comms. I'm moving to intercept. I stopped dead. It wasn't just my words, it was my exact inflection, the slight breath I'd taken before speaking. It was a perfect recording of what I'd said 10 minutes ago. Miller, quit messing around. This isn't the time. The radio chirped again immediately. It was Miller's voice this time, but it sounded wrong, stretched. I've got a visual on a blue windbreaker. Help me. I'm in the blue windbreaker. I'm right behind you. I didn't turn around because I knew Miller was 50 yards to my left. I knew the hiker had been missing for 3 days, and I knew my radio didn't have a recording function. I keyed the mic one last time. Miller, if you can hear me, get to the extraction point now. The radio didn't repeat me. Instead, I heard the sound of a zipper, a slow, metallic sliding sound right in my ear, like someone was unzipping a jacket standing inches behind my head. We never found the kid. We found the windbreaker, though. It was zipped shut, lying flat in the mud. When we opened it, there was nothing inside but 2 gallons of freezing gray mist. Story 5. The Glass Forest. In search and rescue, you learn to trust your eyes. If the trail goes left, you go left. If the cliff drops off, you stop. But in the northwest corner of the park, near the Kootenai boundary, there's a section we call the mirror stand. I was out there solo, checking on a remote sensor that had gone offline. The air felt heavy, like the humidity was at 200%, but without the heat. It was freezing. And then I saw the first crack. It wasn't in a tree. It was in the air. A jagged silver line hanging 3 feet off the ground, perfectly still. I thought it was a spider web at first until I caught the light hitting it. It looked like a fracture in a window pane. When I moved my head, the view through the crack didn't match the forest around it. On my side, it was mid-August. Lush green ferns, thick cedar, moss everywhere. But through that sliver in the air, it was midwinter. I could see bare, skeletal branches covered in a thick layer of frost. I could see my own breath, but only when I exhaled toward the crack. I reached out, my hand shaking, and touched the edge. It didn't feel like glass. It felt like nothing. My fingers just disappeared. On my side, my hand was gone. Through the crack, I could see a pale, blue-tinted version of my gloved hand reaching into a frozen wasteland. The moment my skin touched that winter air, the cold was so sharp it felt like a burn. I pulled back, and the crack shivered. That's when I realized it wasn't just one crack. The entire grove was full of them, hundreds of tiny, shimmering fractures in reality, and through some of them, things were looking back. I saw eyes, huge, pale, and unblinking, staring out from the winter side. They weren't animals. They were too high up, and they didn't have pupils. I didn't fix the sensor. I turned around and walked back the way I came, never taking my eyes off the ground. Because the scariest part wasn't the winter or the eyes. It was the fact that when I looked at my GPS, the map showed I was standing in the middle of a lake that had been dry for 50 years. Story 6. The Official Lie. August 14th was my last day in uniform. The call came in at EO 400. A nuisance bear in the North Ridge campground. A camper had reported something trying to get into their tent. Something large and aggressive, standard procedure. I grabbed my gear, expecting to find a shredded cooler and a terrified family. But the campground was empty. Not because the people had left. The tents were still there, the fires still smoldering, but there wasn't a soul in sight. No footprints leading away, no signs of a struggle, just absence. I moved to the perimeter, my flashlight cutting through the heavy timber. That's when I found the cedar. The sap was fresh, leaking down the trunk in thick amber ribbons, and there, 30 feet above the ground, was the print. I climbed a nearby ridge to get a level look. It wasn't a claw mark, it wasn't a bear's pad, it was a hand, human in shape, but the fingers were too long, the palm too wide. It had been pressed into the bark with enough force to shatter the wood underneath. I took the photos. I measured the height, 32 feet. Nothing human and nothing that lives in these woods stands that tall while leaving a delicate 5-fingered print. When I got back to the station, my supervisor was already waiting. He didn't ask about the campers. He didn't ask about the bear. He just held out a pre-written report. "Black bear," he said. "Juvenile male, relocated to the high country. Sign it." I told him about the prints. I told him about the height. I showed him the digital camera. He didn't even look at the screen. He just took the SD card out of the slot, dropped it on the floor, and crushed it under his boot. "The report says it was a bear," he repeated, his voice as cold as the winter cracks in the mirror stand. "You sign it, or you lose your pension. People come here to feel safe. They don't come here to hear the truth." I signed the paper. I watched the official lie become part of the record, but he didn't know I'd already synced the photos to the cloud from my handheld. I'm looking at the print right now on my laptop. The way the sap glows in the light, the way the fingers seem to reach toward something just out of frame. There's something about these woods that feels different. We tell ourselves we're the ones in charge because we have the maps and the radios and the titles, but the maps don't cover everything. And the truth is just a report that someone hasn't burned yet. The maps we carry aren't meant to guide us. They're meant to convince us there's nowhere left to hide. But there's something about the way a forest goes silent at night that feels different, like the trees are holding their breath waiting for you to stop moving. We tell ourselves these stories to find the patterns, but the patterns only work if you're the one looking. You've heard what the reports won't say. Now, tell me, if you found the print on that cedar tree, would you have signed the official lie to save your life? Or would you have kept the photos? Leave your answer in the shadows below, and as always, like and subscribe for more tales from the Fiend.